So Jeffery Dahmer really did ramp up his offending. The scale and the nature of his behaviour became all the more grotesque. So he wasn't just killing people, dismembering them, and then disposing of their bodies. He started to do some really bizarre things.
He was in the process of constructing some hideously diabolical shrine in his bedroom out of the skulls and skeletons of some of his victims. It's almost as though some bizarre, archaic thing had broken through and he was performing or creating some sort of ancient, human sacrificial temple in this little Milwaukee apartment.
In 1990, Dahmer killed another 4 young men. His MO was becoming more and more polished.
He would offer his victims money to go back to his apartment with him to take pictures, nude photographs of them, and then perhaps to have sex. Every single one of his victims went with him willingly. He would offer them a drink, and once he found out what they wanted to drink, he kept a lot of things on hand, different kinds of alcohol, and that's when he would put a drug in it that would put them to sleep, or that would relax them so that they would pass out.
They would pass out. He would then have sex with them while they were passed out, do with them as he wished, but of course they couldn't do to him. Then as they approached recovery, coming out of it, he would strangle them to death.
It seemed as though Dahmer got a thrill, not from the murder, but from the dead bodies of his victims.
Dahmer liked necrophilia. He liked sex with unconscious people. He wasn't a slasher in the sense that he took delight in killing. His purpose was sex with these people, company with these people. That's hard to believe.
He would commit necrophiliac sex acts on the corpses, dismember the corpses, dissolve parts of the bodies in these vats of acid he had, keep certain organs in his refrigerator, some of which he would actually cannibalize.
Dahmer said that the cannibalism that he engaged in was born out of a curiosity. He wanted to find out, first of all, what that would be like. He also said that there was an element of wanting to make these people a part of him, so they would be with him forever.
Dahmer, from the beginning, was driven by this terror of being alone. He said he killed his first victim, Stephen Hicks, when Hicks said he had to go, and Dahmer didn't want to be alone. There's some desire, which is part of normal sexuality. You love somebody, somebody will say, oh, I love you so much, I want to eat you up. With normal people, that's obviously metaphorical, but it does express some desire to be so close to the person that you want to incorporate them into, you want to merge with them. With somebody like Dahmer, that becomes this very literal horror.
And the horror only became worse when Dahmer began experimenting with his semi-conscious victims.
He would drill holes in their skulls and put muriatic acid inside to see if he could get them to a zombie state so that he could keep them alive and subservient to him.
It's essentially an amateur version of attempting to perform a lobectomy or a lobotomy, but it would be an incredibly unpleasant and damaging thing to do to someone's brain. If you affect the frontal lobes, you will affect personality, potentially make somebody docile. If he's less accurate, you could essentially cause a stroke that could cause paralysis, speech problems. It really very much depends on which part of the brain is actually damaged.
But, of course, that didn't work, and his victims died one after another. Hearing about that is the stuff of horror movies. And the fact that it was happening in a city where we were known for manufacturing and beer and a very good Midwestern work ethic, tight families, this isn't the kind of thing that happens here.
In May 1991, 31-year-old Jeffery Dahmer was in his killing prime. He'd already murdered 11 men and had begun collecting bones and skulls from his victims and cannibalizing their organs. What would have been a nightmare for most was a fantasy for him. and he carefully went about his killings under the radar of the police and the people of Milwaukee.
Jeffery Dahmer had a job in a local chocolate factory, and I think for him it enabled him to maintain a facade of normality. He was just an average Joe, a regular guy who went to work every day.
I think he killed so many people without being caught because of the fact that he looked like everyone else. He did what successful serial killers do. He blended. They blend in with society. Now, he was a Caucasian male living in a predominantly African-American neighborhood, but he didn't talk to anybody. He didn't bother anybody. He was barely someone people noticed. Barely noticed. He also was targeting people who, he found out, might not be missed.
For most people, if they were to commit the type of acts that Jeffery Dahmer did, they would no way be able to function normally. But Jeffery Dahmer was not most people. He hasn't got the same level of repulsion and shock at dead bodies or mutilated bodies that most of us have. It was just another aspect of his life.
It was not known that we had a serial slayer loose in our city. We did not know because he was so cleverly disposing of the bodies. The families were reporting the sons were missing, but the police were not finding bodies. And not infrequently, young men, something happens in their life, they just up and leave town. That happens enough that the police don't get worried. If it's a woman, they'll immediately commit resources to investigate, but young men, they don't.
But on May the 26th, 1991, Dahmer came agonizingly close to capture after an encounter with a 14-year-old boy.
Dahmer had taken Konarak Synthesyphone, a young Asian male who he found attractive. He met him in the mall, offered him money to go back to his apartment. He went, and he began to work the ritual. Dahmer would drug him, and then he began the process of this crude lobotomy, and he had drilled a hole in this young man's head. He took a break. He ran out to get more beer. While he was gone, Konarak ran out of the apartment. He was naked, he was completely dazed, and he was running up the alley next to Dahmer's apartment building. A woman in another apartment building saw him running up the alley and said, "There's a boy running up the alley, something's going on," and then these women called the police.
And then Dahmer appeared. And again, this is another remarkable characteristic of these psychopaths, is that they have an ability to maintain, a kind of coolness under the most extraordinarily high-pressured circumstances.
So he walked up to the officers. "Good evening, officers." He's very polite, he's sober, and he said, "This is my boyfriend. He came to stay with me. We had a little bit too much to drink, and he ran out of the house." He said, "How old is he?" Dahmer said, "He's 19. And the officers said, "Okay, well, just to make sure, let's all walk back up to the apartment together."
The cops went in and looked around. They even peeked into the bedroom where there was a decomposing corpse of one of Dahmer's previous victims, but, they took such a cursory look at it that they didn't even notice it.
Assuming the couple were having a lover's tiff, the two police officers left Konarak alone with Dahmer in the apartment building. And in the early hours of the morning, he murdered the 14-year-old boy. An opportunity to catch the killer had been missed.
I think that really speaks volumes about the attitudes of the police at the time in terms of ethnic minorities, in terms of young people, in terms of the gay community, and that was another victim that could potentially have been saved. So there's this terrible thing going on behind closed doors and people just aren't seeing it. People aren't wanting to see it. Even the police are not joining up the dots and finding out what's really going on. So this is allowed to just bubble away and get worse.
After evading capture, Dahmer was free to continue.
There was two sides, really, to Dahmer's pleasure that he got from killing his victims. So he was a sadist who enjoys the pain and suffering of other people. And with sadists, that thrill ends when the victim dies. But Dahmer was also something of a necrophiliac who was interested in having corpses around and doing things with those corpses. And that means that the thrill starts with death. So he has this continuous fulfillment going on. And he's always fully in control. And I think that's what's really at the root of Jeffrey Dahmer. It's power and it's control, and it's the feeling that he has all this knowledge about what he's done and nobody else quite knows what he's up to.
By July 1991, Dahmer's desire to kill had become insatiable. In just 16 days, he murdered 4 more men, bringing his total number of victims to 17. But Dahmer's reign of terror was about to come to an end. On July the 22nd, he met a man called Tracy Edwards.
While they were together in the apartment, Dahmer threw a handcuff on him. This was now the beginning of his ritual. Dahmer had taken photographs of his victims in various stages of dismemberment, Polaroids. And those were sitting on the dresser inside the bedroom. They weren't sitting out in the main living room, but there was some speculation that Tracy Edwards had perhaps seen that. And he ran out of the apartment in his underwear, ran down the street, and when he saw the police car, Tracy Edwards has said his intention was just to get the handcuff off. That's all he wanted. He stopped these cops to say, hey, can you just get this off of me? So he stopped, and the officers start talking to him about what he saw, and then they said, well, we should probably check this out. Let's all go back to the apartment. Dahmer answered, and the minute he saw that it was the police, he tried to shut the door on them. The police pushed the door open a bit. They started struggling with him, and then finally, he just gave in. And that was when Dahmer was officially finished. He was finished killing, and he knew that he was finished.
His story begins over 50 years ago. Volker Eckert was born in the small East German town of Plauen on July the 1st, 1959. From a very young age, he developed a fascination with women's hair.
When he was 9 years old, he started to be fond of the doll of his sister, a doll which had long hair, and he put them in front of him on his bed. He was feeling sexual arousal, plunging his hands into the hair of this doll.
We describe him as a trichophiliac. This is somebody who gains sexual pleasure from hair, essentially. And I think he would have been aware of the fact that this was something odd, this was something out of the ordinary. And I think that would have created a bit of a sense of shame within him. So he was aware that this was something that he had to keep hidden.
As Eckert entered adolescence, his parents' marriage began to break down.
Well, he had quite a turbulent time during his teenage years. His parents divorced, and he reacted really badly to this.
The separation for him was influential because the father had to leave the house, and he said, I swore to myself, that will never happen to me, and I will not marry because I don't want to work all the time and then be thrown out of the house. And he took sides with his father after that. But he continued to live with his mother.
He went off the rails, and one incident involved taking his parents' car and going off on a bit of a joyride. And then he returned home, and he was in a lot of trouble for that. And it wasn't too long after that incident that he actually went and physically attacked and killed one of his classmates.
In 1974, aged just 14, Eckert experienced taking a life for the very first time. But it wasn't until his arrest in November 2006, over 3 decades later, that anyone knew about it.
Volker Eckert
confessed to killing a classmate and to disguising her murder as a suicide. And that crime was not solved for years, or for almost 32 years.
On May the 7th, 1974, Eckert had knocked on the door of his 14-year-old school friend and neighbour, Sylvia Unterdörfel. Realising her parents weren't home, he took the opportunity of living out the fantasy he'd dreamed of since playing with his sister's doll as a child.
And then he thought, well, I have to do it with a real girl. And he, of course, like many fetishists, they realize they won't do it voluntarily with me. So I have to force them.
She was somebody who had very long, very beautiful hair, and he developed a real fixation, a real obsession with her hair. And he went to where she lived, her home, and basically wormed his way in.
First, this girl only played a role in his fantasy as a victim. But the point came when this fantasy wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to do it. He wanted to stroke her and then kill her.
He started right away after she let him in, closed the door, and he started getting at her throat and started to strangle her. And when she was unconscious, he plunged his hands into her hair.
Even as a teenager, Eckert had the sophistication to try and disguise the murder.
He strangled her with a clothesline, but he was quite cunning because he thought he needs to cover this up. So what he did is attach the end of the clothesline to a door handle to make it look as if she'd killed herself.
It is physically possible to hang yourself from a doorknob. You don't have to have your full body weight on the neck. And it's something that is occasionally seen, although it's uncommon.
Ihre Mutter, als sie dann von der Arbeit kam, hat die...
Just as her mother was getting home from work, she walked in to find her dead daughter. Of course, like with every unnatural death, the East German investigation authorities began their work and came to the conclusion that it was a suicide.
Es war ein Selbstmord.
At the end, Eckert managed to set up the scene so cleverly that the police fell into his trap.
And for 32 years, right up until Volker Eckert's confession, her parents had lived with the belief that their daughter had taken her own life.
When 47-year-old truck driver Volker Eckert was apprehended on the 17th of November 2006, the police had no idea of the extent of his history of murder. Eckert had been on the run for 2 weeks after killing a Bulgarian prostitute in the north of Spain. When detectives searched the cab of his articulated lorry, they found photographs and hair clippings from 5 women whom he'd abducted and murdered across Europe. Eckert's defense lawyer was Alexander Schmidtgall.
He confessed immediately after he got arrested by the police. You have this quite often when you have serial killers or when you have people who have a burden carried with them for a long time. It was like a relief for him to speak with someone and to tell what he did. Yeah? So it was like a confession in a church for him.
Schmidtgall couldn't believe the person he was talking to was the same cold-blooded killer he'd read about in the police files.
So you think there's a monster in front of you, but the actual communication with him, he was a very normal guy. He was like someone selling you life insurance. He was nothing special.
Prosecutors wanted to find out what was going on inside the head of Volker Eckert. He was sent off to be assessed by forensic psychologist Professor Norbert Nedopil.
He came from prison, guided by 2 policemen, into my offices. And then he sat with me for several hours alone, without policemen and without any handcuffs. And we had a long and serious conversation, sometimes sad, sometimes for him or frightening events, sometimes also were very nice and personal, and even sometimes we laughed together.
Eckert, who lived in the small town of Horf in Germany, had murdered his final victim on November the 2nd, 2006. Local journalist Rainer Meyer remembers the story well.
Volker Eckert hat seine letzte Tat.
Volker Eckert's last victim was the prostitute Milena Petrova near Ostelrich in Catalonia, North Spain.
Spanien, Katalonien. Dort hat die...
He picked her up there and abused her in his lorry. He spent another day driving around.
Herumgefahren in der Fahrerkabine. Und am nächsten Morgen.
And the morning after, he dumped her at a nearby stone bridge.
Steinbruch in der Nähe entsorgt.
On the way back from the stone bridge, he was caught on CCTV.
Einer Überwachungskamera.
Somebody was erecting CCTV cameras, which hadn't been there before, and just to test them, panned. One of the images it caught was Eckert's lorry. And when the body that he dumped nearby was found, almost the first place the police went was to look at this entirely accidentally caught CCTV imagery, which led them directly to Eckert.
Eckert's job took him all over the continent. A Europe-wide search was conducted, and on November the 17th, 2006, detectives found him and his truck at a car wash in Cologne.
When they searched the lorry, they found evidence that this was not a one-off act. There were Polaroid photographs of other victims. There were trophies in the lorry. It was perfectly obvious that this was Eckert's lair. Almost every serial killer in one form or another has what's come to be known as a lair. And in his case, it wasn't so much a flat or a cottage or a house. It was the cab of his lorry.
After his arrest, Eckert immediately confessed to a murderous career that had lasted for over 30 years. It was the beginning of a huge international story.
Es waren 5 Morde, 3 in Spanien.
There were 5 murders, 3 in Spain, 2 in France. And from then on, it was a really hot story. As a journalist, you don't have a serial killer very often. And at that point, I tried to get as much information as I could about this person.
Über diesen Menschen herauszubekommen.
For local journalists in Horf, the trial of this perverse killer, due to take place in the local courthouse, was set to be a huge story.
Ja, jede Schlagzeile ist gut für eine Zeitung und jede spektakuläre.
Every headline is good for a newspaper, and every spectacular story is good for a newspaper. And it isn't the newspaper's fault that it interests people.
Alles, was nicht normal ist.
But everything that isn't normal stirs people. And if someone living in a community finds out that the nice uncle was not actually the nice uncle that everyone thought he was, but a perverse serial killer, then that stirs people too. And then they want to know as much as possible about it. And we are there for the purpose of delivering that information.
Menschen auch, und dann wollen die möglichst viel darüber wissen und diese Information zu liefern, dafür sind wir da.
While waiting for his trial in custody, Eckert had lost the support of his family.
I remember very well he was very desperate that he had completely lost the contact to his family because his sister was always a very important point of contact for him through his whole life, and she didn't want to have contact with him.
Dann saß also in Bayreuth in dieser Justizvollzugsanstalt.
He was sitting inside his cell in the prison of Bayreuth and had a lot of time to think.
An seinem 48. Geburtstag.
On his 48th birthday, the 1st of July 2007, he knew that he would be officially charged with murder within the next few days.
Dass als Mörder angeklagt werden wird.
Nobody came to see him that day. His sister didn't visit, and neither did his brother.
Andere Familie, sein Bruder nicht.
It all became too much for him. On the night of his 48th birthday, July the 1st, 2007, Volker Eckert was left alone in his cell. The following morning, his body was found hanging from the bars. Peter Sutcliffe is one of the most infamous killers in British history. For 5 years he evaded capture while brutally murdering 13 young women across the north of England. It was an investigation with twists and turns and a case that still haunts the British public to this day.
For years, women and girls felt that simply leaving their homes at night meant taking their lives in their hands.
When Sutcliffe was eventually apprehended on January the 2nd, 1981, it brought an end to a manhunt that had both terrified and captivated the nation. The press had dubbed him the Yorkshire Ripper.
For women, it was a very frightening time, and they were stuck in this awful position of being told they shouldn't go out at night. It had an enormous social effect on the country.
As well as his 13 victims, Sutcliffe had attacked at least 7 more women. His arrest was a huge relief for the under-pressure detectives at West Yorkshire Police.
He attacked at random. We couldn't anticipate his moves. The whole of the north of England was held in a grip of terror, really, by this man. There was a sort of, I can only describe it as a Gothic-type cloud over the area.
But the Yorkshire Ripper's story begins over 70 years ago. Peter Sutcliffe was born on the 2nd of June 1946 in the market town of Bingley on the outskirts of Bradford, West Yorkshire.
He was the youngest of quite a large family. His brothers and sisters were all of strong character. They were all working class, could look after themselves. But Peter was a shy boy and very much attached to his mother.
His mother was somebody who was very much dominated and controlled by his father. So I think he had quite a lot of sympathy for his mum, and he thought the world of her as a child. But Peter was somebody who was quite shy, quite awkward, he was quite skinny and scrawny. And I don't think he ever lived up to his father's expectations. And I think that planted that seed of shame in Peter Sutcliffe that would come to shape the rest of his life.
Sutcliffe's awkward demeanour as a child manifested into a dysfunctional adulthood, demonstrated in his early career choices.
Peter Sutcliffe had a variety of different jobs throughout his life. He worked as a gravedigger for quite a period of time, and it was reported that he stole things from the corpses that he was burying. Now that suggests to me that he wasn't horrified or repulsed by dead bodies, and that's something that would be quite influential later on.
On Valentine's Day 1967, 21-year-old Sutcliffe met Sonia Shermer. The pair began a long-term relationship, eventually getting married in August 1974.
The relationship that he had with his wife, Sonia, appeared to have been a decent one, and I think he would have treated her fairly well because she served a purpose for him. Women like his mother and his wife, he saw as carers and nurturers, people who would look after him. Other women, I think he saw somewhat differently. I think Peter Sutcliffe's view of women is very black and white. They are either Madonnas or they are whores. So they're either these perfect domestic angels or they're these sinful creatures.
These opposing views on women collided with one another when a family revelation dramatically altered 23-year-old Sutcliffe's world. His mother, whom he'd looked up to as a child, had been unfaithful.
His mother had had an affair with a policeman, and his father had decided to confront his wife at a hotel where she was meeting this particular man, and took Peter with him.
Peter's father basically humiliated her and said, look, I know all about what's going on, and the children found out as well. So I think this kind of further cemented ideas as to what women were, what could be expected of them, always to be cautious and wary of them.
I think there was every possibility that after seeing his mother and seeing what happened, that possibly preyed on his mind and affected his attitude towards women.
Sutcliffe began to visit the red light districts of Yorkshire and find solace in prostitutes. But his feelings for these women would soon lead to violence and eventually murder. On the morning of October the 30th, 1975, just 12 miles away in the Chapeltown area of Leeds, the body of 28-year-old Wilma McCann was discovered in a local park.
Wilma McCann was a Scottish woman who had come down to Yorkshire. She was working as a prostitute. She was very hard up, and it was very difficult for her because she had young children, young family to support. And I think that was the only way she felt she could get enough money.
The attack on Wilma McCann set in motion what would become a clear pattern and regular method of ambush by the killer.
His modus operandi was to use a ball-peen hammer and was to strike them very hard and very fast on the back of the head so they fell unconscious. He used his hammer and hit her over the back of the head, and then he stabbed her 15 times in the neck, chest and abdomen.
But the police were no closer to catching the killer, and 3 months later, on the 20th of January 1976, Another woman was murdered in Leeds, 42-year-old wife and mother Emily Jackson, who'd vanished after a night out at her local pub. Emily's son Neil was 17 years old at the time. He remembers receiving the tragic news on that fateful morning.
I've come downstairs. My dad's loading one of the vans up for work, and I'm getting my boots on ready for going to work and having a pot of tea, when they were knocking at the door and it opened the police. And that's when I first knew. And it was first knew when, like I said, for Dad, when the police knocked at the door. I can still remember it plain as day.
Again, a hammer had been used in the brutal attack. Emily had also been stabbed a total of 52 times with a screwdriver. Like Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson had been working as a prostitute to make ends meet.
It was just to help the family in dire straits, is what I've been told afterwards. When family were in hard times work-wise, she went elsewhere, but I didn't realise till well after.
This time, police were able to recover from the scene a key piece of evidence. On Emily's right thigh was a very firm and visible footprint from a size 7 Wellington boot.
For some inexplicable reason, he stamped on her thigh with such force that it left an imprint of the sole of his boot on her thigh. Now, police tried to trace that boot, or the manufacturers of the boot, which they did, and then try and find out people who had bought them, but it didn't come to anything.
Once again, the trail went cold. It was over a year until a murder with a familiar MO took place in Leeds. On the morning of February the 5th, 1977, the body of 28-year-old Irene Richardson was discovered. She'd been savagely murdered, another prostitute killed with a hammer. West Yorkshire police were suddenly dealing with a serial killer. What they didn't realise is that this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most infamous series of murders in British history. Less than 3 months after the death of a third victim, Irene Richardson, the killer struck again. On the night of the 23rd of April 1977, 32-year-old prostitute Patricia Atkinson became victim number 4. She was murdered in her own flat, this time not in Leeds, but in nearby Bradford.
She believed that if she invited customers into her flat, she was safe, because all the killings had taken place in isolated parks or back alleys. So she thought she was safe, but she wasn't.
The killer hit Patricia 4 times around the head with a hammer and then mutilated her body with a knife. This time, detectives found a clue to link the murders of Patricia Atkinson and Emily Jackson.
The police found the same boot mark on the bedclothes at Patricia's house, Patricia's flat, as they'd found on Emily Jackson's thigh.
This crucial link confirmed the authorities' worst fears. The killer was expanding his hunting ground, and he seemed to have a favoured target. All 4 murder victims had been working as prostitutes. On the 17th of November 1980 in Leeds, Jacqueline Hill, a 20-year-old student, was hit over the head, stabbed repeatedly and mutilated. An attack that bore all the hallmarks of the Ripper. But Jacqueline Hill would be Peter Sutcliffe's final victim. Within 2 months, a routine police stop would lead to one of the most sensational arrests of modern times. The capture of the Yorkshire Ripper.
Just after New Year, on January 2nd, 1981, Peter went to Sheffield and picked up a prostitute. On the same evening, a policeman with a lot of years of service decided to show a young rookie round Sheffield.
The 2 police officers spotted Sutcliffe's car near offices on Melbourne Avenue in Sheffield's red light district. They decided to approach and talk to the pair.
The cops asked, what's your girlfriend's name? He said, I don't know, we've only just met. And the policeman said, you know, I haven't just fallen off a Christmas tree. So he already realised there was something odd going on.
Peter said that he needed to urinate, and the officers let him go up to a wall by the side of the building. While he was away, the young police officer did a PNC check on the registration of the car and found that the plates were false. So Peter was arrested and taken to Dewsbury police station.
Once down at the station, Sutcliffe was searched. He wasn't carrying any weapons, but this time detectives weren't going to let him slip from their grasp.
So one of them thought, let's go back to that place where we spotted him and let's see if he did leave anything when he popped out of the car saying he was going to have a pee.
The police returned to the scene of the original arrest.
They found the hammer, the intended murder weapon, and they came back with them. And gradually after that, Peter Sutcliffe realized that the game was up, and eventually he confessed. And his only condition was that he be allowed to tell his wife, Sonia, before it became known to the general public that he was indeed the Yorkshire Ripper.
It had been over 5 years since the murder of Wilma McCann, but detectives finally had the Ripper in custody.
At the start, at the outset, Cooper was simply a belligerent, arrogant bully who was an armed robber and preyed on women alone. It was a long time before all the dots were joined up and it was revealed that Cooper was much more than simply an armed robber. He was actually a quadruple murderer, rapist and sexual assaulter.
This killer's story begins on the 3rd of September 1944. John William Cooper was born in Milford Haven, Wales. He was one of 7 children. His father worked as an agricultural labourer, and soon John Cooper himself would work the fields as a local farmhand.
He was part of the post-war baby boom generation. He left school at 15, he got involved in a range of different trades, which wasn't anything particularly unusual. So he appeared to have a fairly regular upbringing. There aren't any really obvious signs of the trauma, the abuse, or the neglect that we see in cases of serial killers.
He left home at 15. One of the reasons why he was able to leave is because he was a fairly talented guy around the farm, in a rural environment. He could do a lot of things, so he could get by. And he was a very independent person. Most children wouldn't leave then because they'd be afraid to. He wasn't afraid because he was a man, he could take care of himself.
He was quite well known in the local farming community, you know, making his way in the world.
Soon, the wayward Cooper settled down to family life. He married his childhood sweetheart at the age of 21, and before long they welcomed a son and a daughter into the world.
From the outside, Cooper did appear to be a regular family guy. They had 2 children, so looking in, they looked to be the ideal nuclear family. Cooper presented quite a respectable veneer to the outside world.
But the married man Cooper liked to indulge outside of the family home.
He did quite enjoy the high life. He liked going out and drinking and gambling, and he was gregarious. The people that knew him socially thought he was a stand-up guy, but actually he had a very short fuse. He would lose his temper very easily. So here's somebody who's crafting this performance of self, which isn't the real him.
He was quite well known in the local community, quite well liked, known to have a violent temper, but nevertheless, you know, one of the boys, so to speak, in the local pub.
In 1978, at the age of 34, Cooper found work with the multi-million-dollar oil giant Gulf, working as a welder's mate at the local refinery. That same year, Cooper himself struck it rich, winning a newspaper competition, Spot the Ball.
He won £90,000, a fortune. In today's terms, it would probably £500,000, as well as a £4,000 Austin princess. If he had been a more temperate man, he would probably have saved some of that money.
But after giving £1,000 each to 10 of his family members, the generosity seemed to stop there. Cooper, the gambler, started burning a hole through his lucky winnings.
This is a life-changing amount of money. But he didn't hold on to it for very long. I think because he did live that fast and high lifestyle, he continued to gamble, he continued to drink, he invested in fairly misplaced business ventures. So he was soon parted from that money. But once that money was gone, it didn't get rid of that sense of entitlement, that sense in which I want to have these things that I was able to buy before.
There's a hypomanic quality to it. He looks to me like he probably was what some people call a cyclothymic personality or manic depressive illness. And in his moments of euphoria, he gambles, he thinks he can do anything, and all of a sudden he looks down and his money's gone.
The seemingly happy-go-lucky John Cooper was in fact deeply troubled beneath the surface. His teenage son particularly bore the brunt of Cooper's rage. Not vulnerable victims. The out-of-control Cooper would soon resort to desperate ways of covering up his offences. Murder.
There's every indication that his loss of his money through gambling was the seeds of his life as a criminal. He got used to the neighbors thinking of him as kind of the rich guy. All of a sudden, he didn't have any money. And so the crimes that he goes out to commit, they're burglaries.
With no sign of getting caught during his 2-year crime spree around rural Pembrokeshire, Cooper thought he was on a winning streak. On the night of the 22nd of December 1985, he racked the stakes up even higher. His next target was barely a mile from his own doorstep, Scoverston Manor in Stainton.
Now, they are local farmers, they're quite wealthy, and Cooper is known to them, so this is quite a close-knit community.
They're a rich and reclusive pair called Richard and Helen Thomas. They lived in a 3-storey farmhouse set in considerable acres, not more than a mile from where Cooper actually lived. Cooper got there thinking that Helen would be on her own, burst in, threatened her with the shotgun.
But unbeknownst to Cooper, Helen's brother Richard was close by.
Unexpectedly, Richard returned, almost without thinking. Cooper turns his shotgun on Richard and kills him. He ties up Helen and shoots her in the face, killing her.
The siblings were both shot at close range in the head, but brother Richard was also wounded in the stomach.
A close-range discharge with a shotgun will almost completely destroy the head. If Richard was shot in the stomach first, he'd be well aware of what had happened to him. For Richard, we can only hope that the shot to the head was first and that he was dead from that. I strongly suspect that the first shot was the one to the abdomen. When it didn't kill him, then there's the fatal shot to the head. The whole situation must have been utterly terrifying.
It was a dastardly, brutal crime in pursuit, of course, of Cooper's lifestyle. But he then sets fire to the house in an effort to conceal the crime.
Taking place, perhaps to disguise it or to alter it or just to do something to it after the murders have been carried out.
And so we scraped away some of this black paint until we found some blood actually sitting on the metal surface of the gun. And we took that and again profiled it, and it again gave us Peter Dixon's profile.
By now, the evidence was stacking up against Cooper. But it was his starring 1989 appearance on Bullseye that was the final nail in the coffin for the killer. Police had heard about Cooper's fondness for the limelight, and in February 2009, a copy of the episode that he appeared on was traced back to ITV's archive in Leeds. They compared it to a sketch of a suspect seen using Peter Dixon's bank card, wearing similar shorts to the ones found in Cooper's home.
When they looked at the video and then compared that video to the artist's impression of the man who might have attacked the Dixons, the two were almost identical. I think the superintendent said it was as if you could trace one over the other. It was almost a perfect match. So now we begin to have the net closing around Cooper.
Now Cooper was back out on the streets, having served 10 years of his 16-year sentence for armed robbery and burglary. But time was running out for the killer.
More and more details being heaped on top of what the police are coming to believe is an absolutely airtight case against Cooper. In May, barely months after he's got out of jail, Cooper is rearrested.
The police even filmed the moment they pounced on Cooper as he went to collect his morning paper, satisfied they'd put this dangerous killer back in prison.
He continues to deny everything. But the forensic evidence is beginning to become overwhelming.
During questioning, Cooper admitted owning the shorts that had the key evidence against him, Peter Dixon's blood. Further forensic tests on the clothing had thrown up something even more interesting.
The hem had actually been taken up, so they took the hem down and they found another piece of DNA evidence. Now, this DNA belonged to the daughter of Peter and Gwenda Dixon, so this proved fairly conclusively that these shorts belonged to Peter Dixon.
Police believe these were stolen from Peter's rucksack just before Cooper fled the murder scene. Cooper was finally brought to Swansea Crown Court on the 22nd of March 2011 to face justice. As well as the expert witnesses lined up to prove the case against him, his own son also took to the stand, unmasking the dark, violent side of the lovable rogue. He revealed his habitual nighttime walks, stalking the local Pembrokeshire countryside, armed and dangerous.
He denied everything. Not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. And for weeks sustained precisely that stance. But that did not convince the jury. The forensic evidence proved decisive, as did the bullseye videotape.
When Cooper returned for sentencing on the 26th of May, he continued to protest his innocence.
You must judge me after the trial, not before.
Judge John Griffith Williams gave him a normal member of the Kansas City community, went from being an upstanding citizen to an infamous serial killer.
Berdella documented the torture and the murder of his victims for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, he wanted to relive and revisit that sense of power he felt when he was doing these things. But secondly, he wanted to create an archive. I think he wanted history to remember him and remember the horrendous things that he'd done.
This killer's story begins in 1949. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. was born on January the 31st, the first of two sons. He was raised in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, in a strict Catholic household.
His father worked at the Ford Motor Company. His mother was a homemaker, so they were very much the traditional American nuclear family.
Berdella was a shy, intelligent child who struggled to fit in at school.
He was bullied by his peers because he did stand out as different. He wore very thick glasses. He went to the algebra club. He collected stamps. So there was that sense in which he always felt that isolation from his peer group.
Then, in his mid-teens, his world was turned upside down.
Berdella's father died of a heart attack when he was 16, and this did have quite a significant impact on him because his mother remarried and she went on to set up another home with somebody else. And I think that Berdella really did feel a sense of rejection here. He was part of his mother's past. The world had moved on and he was left behind.
Around the same time, Berdella had been working part-time.
There's a particular incident that Berdella later recalls that is potentially significant. Berdella claims that he was raped when he was an adolescent at a restaurant where he worked.
Berdella never reported the incident to the police. In 1967, after graduating high school, Berdella enrolled in Kansas City Art Institute. At this time, he'd begun exploring his sexuality.
He'd realized that he was certainly gay, and it was pretty apparent to him that his father would not have approved of that.
He's also been brought up in the Catholic Church, so I think there is very much an underlying sense of shame there.
By 1969, Berdella had begun to experiment with drugs. He quit college after tutors failed to understand his twisted art projects, often involving live animals.
He may have been a bit nerdy to look at and a bit strange, but he was clearly talented.
In need of a job, Berdella put his talents to a new use.
Berdella started working as a short order chef and quickly rose.
He developed quite a good reputation in the local community as people were talking about the food that he was making. And he bought his own house. He had quite a bright future. He really was a figure that commanded respect in the local community.
By his mid to late 20s, Berdella had also developed a passion for collecting, and this hobby soon became a business in its own right.
He was obviously a very good chef, but it wasn't his only talent. He also collected art and antiquities. This was a man of quite considerable taste, working at some of the best restaurants and at the same time operating was also known to Berdella. Actually tipped off the police that they thought that Berdella may have been involved or at least given Jerry a hotshot injection. But there was no body. Nobody knew where Jerry was.
Berdella was put under surveillance, but no evidence was ever found.
Jerry Howell's father always thought that Berdella had done something to his kid. He just couldn't prove it. And but yes, he was very suspicious of him.
Jerry Howell's body was never discovered. Berdella had developed a sick taste for torture and murder. And after getting away with his first crime, he began to look for ever-increasing, horrific ways to get his sexual kicks. 9 months after he tortured and murdered his first victim, 19-year-old Jerry Howell, Robert Berdella took his next victim.
So Robert Sheldon was somebody who had stayed with Berdella before at his house. So there was a degree of trust in this relationship, and it was trust that Berdella really did take advantage of.
On April the 10th, 20-year-old drug addict Robert Sheldon appeared at Berdella's door looking for somewhere to stay after an argument with his girlfriend. Shortly after he set foot inside, Berdella put his sadistic plan into action.
He keeps him for 4 days. Automatically, you know that this is going to be somebody who's in distress. He starts to escalate his cruelty with this victim. He injects drain cleaner into his eyes. He fills his ears with caulking material. There's damage to the hands from piano wire. He's hitting him with a rubber mallet. All of these things are acts of cruelty, and they would not kill you. It's subduing the victim.
He did some horrendous things to him, but the thing that really stood out for me was the tattoo that he gave this victim on his shoulder. He was almost branding this man, saying, "You are mine, I own you and I possess you."
Like he had with his first victim, Berdella documented his methods by writing intricate notes. This time he went one step further and included himself in the photographs with his tormented victim.
He wanted an absolute record of everything he'd done. It was a certain amount of pride. There is no doubt whatever that that's what was in his mind. He documented it because he was proud of it.
On the 14th of April, Berdella arrived home to find a workman he knew on the roof of his property. Concerned that he'd be discovered, he decided to kill Robert.
He becomes quite paranoid because he knows this guy. So Berdella takes matters into his own hands and he goes and places a plastic bag over the head of his victim, essentially ending his life.
Berdella began his ritual act of cutting up his victim's body piece by piece.
Dismembering a body is not the easiest thing in the world to do, but if you have some knowledge, like a surgeon or a chef, then you can quite effectively dismember a body, and that makes it easier to dispose of.
This horrific expertise in chopping up bodies later earned Berdella the nickname the Kansas City Butcher. In keeping with his obsession with collecting, this time Berdella decided he wanted to keep a souvenir of his actions.
Berdella's second victim, Robert. He dismembered the body and cut off the head. But this time, he didn't put it all into black garbage bags and put it out for the garbage truck. He kept the head first in the freezer, the skull, which was all that remained at that point, into a closet in the upstairs of his house.
Heads are very, very significant for Berdella, and I think the head of Larry is a very important one because this is the guy who has come closest to Berdella's fantasy of having this sex slave. He's the guy who's survived for 6 weeks. He's survived the longest, and I think he wants to commemorate that.
But Berdella's barbarous nature was far from satisfied. On March the 29th, 1988, he picked up 22-year-old male prostitute Christopher Bryson and took him back to his house.
So Christopher Bryson was wandering the streets when Robert Berdella picks him up, and he offers him a beer, and they drive around in his car for a while. Berdella then says, well, come back to my house and you can have a beer there. So Christopher agrees and they go back.
He was brought home to provide sexual favors for Berdella and was told to go upstairs as soon as they got there. As Bryson mounted the stairs and started walking up, he was struck from behind and rendered unconscious.
With his victim sedated and held captive, Berdella began his deadly ritual.
Once again, he is tortured, he is assaulted, he is given bleach in the eyes, but this time it's swabbed onto the eyeballs rather than injected in. That would probably be even more painful. There are many nerve endings on the globe of the eye which would react very badly to the bleach.
Repeatedly electrocuted, raped and injected with a cocktail of sedatives, Christopher remained a submissive captive for 4 days. But on the morning of April the 2nd, 1988, when Berdella had left for work, Christopher managed to set himself free.
He finds some matches and he's able to actually burn through the robes that Berdella had restrained him with. So he flees the house wearing only a dog collar.
He must have been an extraordinary sight, a naked man wearing a dog collar. He runs across the street, meets a meter reader who's going to a house. They knock on the door. The house owner is astonished, opens the door astonished, won't let Christopher into the house, but does call the police.
Roy Orth was a sergeant with the Kansas City Police Department when they received the call.
Chris had been severely physically abused and was asking for help. District officers got there, found this was probably going to be some kind of an unlawful restraint, abduction situation, and called the Sex Crimes Child Abuse Unit, and our detective responded.
Rick Holtzclaw was the assistant prosecutor for the Sex Crimes Unit in Kansas City.
Roy Orth called me and said, "We need you." And I said, "You don't need me today." And he said, "No, I'm telling you, we need you on this one." He may have told me briefly what it was. We had someone who had escaped naked with a dog collar. It became evident that they were going to need some assistance, so I went to the home on that Saturday afternoon, and we began the investigation, getting search warrants, and that's how it began.
In just over a 3-year period, Berdella had held, brutally raped, tortured and killed 6 men and got away with it. Unknown to the police, they were about to uncover the shocking crimes committed by a sadistic serial killer, Robert Berdella. Troy Cole was the lead detective in charge of the case.
I first became aware of him April 2nd, 1988. I was working in the homicide unit. It was a Saturday, and was called out in regards to a sodomy. The guy alleged that he had been kidnapped.
Sexual assault and murder of innocents, just wee girls, is particularly horrific.
Black was finally arrested in 1990 after trying to snatch a young girl in broad daylight. He was eventually convicted of 4 child murders between 1981 and 1986, His youngest victim was only 5 years old.
I think the impact of the Robert Black case on the community and on the nation was pretty devastating. This was the end of the idea of the innocence of childhood. After the Black case, I think parents started putting more restrictions on their children's freedom.
Pat Cardy's 9-year-old daughter Jennifer was abducted and murdered by Black in 1981. But it would take several years before she knew who was responsible for killing her daughter.
We still miss her, particularly our 2 boys. When she was taken, how hard, how difficult, how heavy it was upon them, not understanding anything, but just knowing that she would never be there again. That was brutal.
Journalist Tim Tate investigated Black's life in the hope of discovering why he did what he did.
They were terrible crimes. He probably killed more children than any other convicted child sex serial killer in Britain.
This killer's story begins in 1947. Robert Black was born on the 21st of April in Grangemouth, about 20 miles from Edinburgh, Scotland.
Robert Black's mother was unmarried at the time. There was a real stigma around illegitimacy, so he was given up. Now, his mother went on to get married and to have 4 other children, but she never ever wanted anything to do with Robert Black. So right from the outset, this is somebody who's facing rejection and exclusion. He's somebody who has come into the world with a stigma on him.
Black was fostered by Jack and Margaret Tulip, who lived in a remote western Scottish village.
They were in their mid-50s. They had no previous experience. They were strict. They were God-fearing, and he's never given their name. He's always Robert Black, something that would have marked him out at the time in that small community.
Black later alleged that his foster parents were abusive towards him.
The foster father died when he was 5, but the foster mother continued the abusive behaviour that had been perpetrated beforehand. So he was beaten when he wet the bed. Here is somebody who does not have a safe or a secure home environment. This is a young boy who has got no comfort from anybody whatsoever.
From this disturbed upbringing, Black unsurprisingly rebelled and developed an unhealthy interest in other children.
By the age of 8, he started offending. He's already developed sexualized behavior. He's taking the time and the trouble to peer up little girls' skirts. He has molested, that's putting it gently, a baby. And he's begun to explore bodily orifices. This is the obsession that will be with him all his life.
In 1958, Black's foster mother died, and he was sent to a children's home near Falkirk. His fascination with sex continued, and along with some other boys in the house, he tried to rape a 12-year-old girl.
I think that act, if you like, was the genesis of Black's paedophilia.
At some point, almost every pedophile who's attracted to a very young girl
was always on the lookout for his next victim. And he had in the back of his van what can only be described as an abduction kit. He had bindings, he had this sack which he would put the child in.
On the 30th of July 1982, Black was on a delivery job in Northumberland, northeast England, near to the village of Coldstream, where a young schoolgirl was leaving her house to go and play with her friends.
Susan Maxwell is 11. She lives with her mum and her stepdad and their children in a little village. It's a happy, warm, loving home. It's a summer. It's afternoon. Susan says she wants to go and play tennis with her friend, and it's agreed that Susan will walk home.
The tragic irony is that she encounters none other than Robert Black and his van.
She had begun walking home, and at some point after 4:30, which is the last time anyone saw her. She was snatched, literally snatched, put in the back of Black's van and driven away.
Susan's mother had changed her mind about letting Susan walk home and decided to pick her daughter up, but there was no sign of her anywhere, and she called the police. Tom Wood was the detective inspector at the Lothian and Borders Serious Crime Squad.
We were sent down to the borders straight away to help with the investigation, and there were huge searches made off the area because we thought that she might have been thrown over the bridge or fallen over the bridge or might have come to harm locally.
On the 12th of August, a body was found near a village in a lay-by in the West Midlands, over 200 miles from where Susan had been abducted.
It was the middle of the summer, and so the body was badly decomposed to the extent it was some time before we discovered that it was actually Susan.
That made it impossible for the coroner to determine an exact cause of death.
Susan was found partially clothed, indicating that she'd been sexually assaulted. The police were desperate to find the person responsible for such a heinous act.
Most people are murdered by someone close to them. So we had to be very, very careful that we didn't go off in flights of fancy and that we did our homework first. Who was with her? When was she last seen? We then looked at local offenders. Were there any young men around who were committing sexual offences? And then we started on the big investigations looking for vehicles that were seen in the vicinity. And we got absolutely nowhere with it whatsoever.
Well, Black avoided capture of characteristics that was physical, that had to do with his fixation. And that second criteria was that no adults had to be near that child or nearby responsible for taking care of that child.
He would rehearse, he would drive round and round, even if he saw a child who he thought matched his image of an ideal victim. He wouldn't abduct straight away. He would monitor, he would look for escape routes, and only when everything was perfect would he pounce.
For Robert Black, these girls were essentially disposable objects. He would abduct them in these blitz attacks off the streets. He'd abuse them, and then he would just discard them. He really was the most remorseless offender.
Robert Black had now killed 4 young girls in just over 4.5 years. His appetite for abducting, abusing, and murdering young children would only intensify. The police had connected the murders of 3 of the young victims, but they were no closer to catching the killer. But a chance encounter would soon change everything.
In July 1990, Black is still driving his van. And this time he returns to the borders of Scotland, a little town called Stow. A retired post office worker is mowing his lawn when he sees a van pull up. He also sees a young girl walk past the van, and then he sees the young girl lifted up and whisked into the van.
With great presence of mind, this guy noted the number of this van accurately and immediately phoned the police. The police attended, and as they were standing discussing the issue on this little road in Stow,
Black drives back down the same road where the same post office worker shouts, "That's the van!" And it is the same van, and it is Black driving it.
a policeman stepped out, stopped the van, then detained the driver, and then searched the van. First found nothing, and then found the wee girl lying in the bottom of the van in a bag, semi-suffocated.
And the man who opens the back doors of the van is the little girl's father, who's a policeman. Can you imagine what impact that must have had on him? There can be no doubt that it was Black's overconfidence, his arrogance, to do something so outrageous in broad daylight in a tiny Scottish town, and what's more then to drive back down the same road in which he's abducted.
And thankfully, the little girl is still alive. She's been sexually assaulted, but she's escaped with her life.
It's important to understand that a serial killer of the kind that Black was, he was an obsessed serial killer, not an incidental serial killer. He was destined to kill over and over and over again. Had he not have been caught that day, that girl would have died and many others would have died.
Now, immediately Robert Black was arrested for that. Literally within the hour, we knew this was the man we were looking for because the modus operandi was so identical.
On the 10th of August 1990, Black pleaded guilty to the abduction and sexual abuse of the 6-year-old girl in Stowe. He was given a life sentence and was sent to Sawton Prison in Edinburgh.